Now, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Giovanni Ruffini. I'm a professor in the Department of History, and I am the current director of Fairfield University's Ancient Mediterranean Studies program. Now, this is a very new role for me because the Ancient Mediterranean Studies program is only about 5 minutes old. Okay? For the preceding 60 plus years here, the Classical Studies program, as it was then known, was the one-man project for many decades of our late colleague and friend, Vincent J. Rosovac, who was the founder, the foundation, and the solo project for classical studies for many years before he, one after another, hired almost all of us who were part of the program. And this is going to be a strange way to put it as I hear myself saying it. In 2018, when he died, we were in some strange way doubly fortunate. He was fortunate because he died doing what he loved. He died on the job teaching classical languages and literature at the institution that he had made his home and his life. And that was the way he would have wanted to go, one way or the other. We were fortunate because he had a family that was determined to carry on his legacy and to help us continue what he had accomplished here at Fairfield University. In particular, I would like to acknowledge and thank his son, Andrew Rosovac, for two very special contributions that he made to the university. First, a contribution to create a permanent named Vincent J. Rosovac Classical Studies annual lecture series. And then a subsequent, even more generous donation to help endow a permanent named chair, the Vincent J. Rosovac Chair in Classical Studies. So without any more ado from me, I'm not the reason you're here, I would like to introduce the man who organized this year's Vincent J. Rosovac Lecture in Classical Studies, the man who holds the Vincent J. Rosovac Chair in Classical Studies, our friend and colleague, Professor Daniel Libatike.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ruffini, for that. As you just heard, my name is Daniel Libatike. I am the Vincent J. Rosovac Assistant Professor of Classical Studies and Assistant Professor of English here at Fairfield University. And we in Ancient Mediterranean Studies, in collaboration with the Magus Corps and the Vincent J. Rosovac Annual Lecture Series in Ancient Mediterranean Studies, are thrilled to welcome as our co-presenters for the lecture this year, Dr. T.H.M. Geller-Goad of Wake Forest University and Dr. Caitlin Hines of the University of Cincinnati. T.H.M. Geller-Goad is Professor of Classics and Denton Fellow at Wake Forest University. He is the author of Laughing Atoms, Laughing Matter, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and Satire, Plautus Curricular, Masks, a commentary on Plautus's Curricular, and the forthcoming Plautus Epictetus. He co-edited with Christopher B. Polt Didactic Literature in the Roman World and co-directed with him the 2023 National Endowment for the Humanities Institute, The Performance of Roman Comedy. And you can find out more about that at romancomedy.wfu.edu. Caitlin Hines is Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Cincinnati. Her research specialties include body metaphor and fertility politics, especially in Latin poetry of the Augustan Age. Her first book, Rome's Visceral Reactions, Politics and Poetics in Flesh and Blood, forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press, because it was submitted just 11 days ago. Congratulations. Explores the shifting valences of the Latin word viscera, entrails, as it expanded from an unmarked anatomical referent into rich political and reproductive metaphors during crisis moments in Roman history. She co-founded the Classics Beyond Whiteness series with T.H.M. Geller-Goad while serving as a postdoctoral fellow at Wake Forest University from 2018 to 2020, which you'll be hearing more about tonight. Their talk tonight is entitled Antiracist Curricular Reform, Big and Small Ideas for 21st Century Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. T.H.M. Geller-Goad and Dr. Caitlin Hines.
Thank you so much for having us. We were so delighted to be invited to meet all of you. You've been so welcoming, and it's been a great experience seeing your beautiful campus, sitting in on your classes, meeting your really incredible students. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much.
So to begin, we just want to quickly define what we mean when we titled this talk Anti-Racist Curricular Reform. What are we doing with those terms? When we describe curricular reform as anti-racist, what we are referring to is a specific mode of engaging with pedagogy that is that refuses to be neutral, right? Anti-racism argues that you cannot, through a unmarked neutral perspective, completely remove systemic injustices. You have to be active about it. You cannot simply conform with tradition, inherit tradition unexamined, uncritically. You need to think really actively and act really actively in an oppositional way to those systemic injustices. And so that is what anti-racism, as our approach, as our angle, it is a set of active efforts in order to oppose systemic injustice. When we speak of curricular reform, we are really thinking very broadly, not just about the course content, what we teach in the classroom. We're also thinking about degree requirements, about institutional requirements for graduations, what courses are you required to take. And we're also thinking about things like what we're doing today, extracurricular programming. Who are you inviting to campus to give lectures? Everything that contributes to a student's experience of moving through an academic space, even beyond just what is on a syllabus for a given course. And we would also, before we dive in, really like to emphasize that this approach, although the word anti-racism, I think, is a relatively more recent coinage, this idea of critical pedagogy, of really practices that amount to anti-racist curricular approaches, it's been around for decades, for centuries. So much of this work was done by Black educators in the 19th and the 20th centuries, especially women. Anna Julia Cooper, Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Jackson Coppin, Lucy Laney, Bell Hooks. And we've given you on this slide a couple resources that you might like to consult. Bell Hooks was really inspired by the third on the list, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then these two other books by Evans and Given are more recent surveys of what Given calls fugitive pedagogy, and what Evans articulates as the essential fundamental contributions of Black educators and Black scholars to this practice of critical pedagogy. Just a quick outline of our goals for today. What we'd like to do, as Professor Libatike mentioned, we founded a program at Wake Forest called Classics Beyond Whiteness. So we want to tell you about it, about what we tried to do, what we accomplished, how we made it happen. And then we're going to run through a set of 6 sort of thematically organized ideas about the kinds of approaches that you can take to anti-racist curricular design. From extracurricular programming to the specifics of course content and how you organize that content, to more specific pedagogical approaches, and then design of your educational spaces, larger institutional level curricular design, and finally we'll take you through practical tips for how to go about making everything happen.
So we'll start with, how did Classics Beyond Whiteness come about? Since 2013, I've been organizing in my department a series of video guest lectures, long before Zoom was on everybody's mind, basically because I came into a department that was intellectually very quiet, and I wanted more intellectual activity, and my department chair was a penny pincher. And so I came up with this idea, a way to get speakers in for cheap by bringing them through web conference. And it worked pretty well, but year after year I would ask my colleagues, who do you want to bring? And I would either get no recommendations or like a scattering of random things. And so in 2018, I thought, okay, I'm going to instead pitch a series of speakers to my colleagues and see what they think. And they nipped. I said it was going to be Classics Beyond Europe, and that was basically my framing for hearing some really interesting work by mostly junior scholars, mostly scholars of color, on classics, on areas that I wanted to learn more about. And it went really well. We had a lot of great talks. One of the people that I invited was at the University of Richmond, and he was like, University of Richmond is so close to Wake Forest, it's a shame I can't come in person, hint, hint, hint. And him giving me that hint was enough that I found some internal money to bring him. That talk was the most attendance we'd had at any talk in the decade I'd been at, almost a decade then I'd been at Wake Forest at that point. And so I was like, oh, okay, this thing has legs. So Professor Hines and I, when we were looking ahead to the following year, 2019-2020, we said, okay, what can we do to make it even bigger? What can we do to build on our successes? And so we scheduled a time to go on a walk with her lovely dog, Mo, the best animal on the planet, and just think blue sky. If there were no restrictions, what would we do? What could we bring in? Informing this was that Wake Forest had, like many southern schools after the governor of Virginia at the time had been found to have posed in photos like as in blackface or in Klan robes when he was in med school. Wake Forest had had its own reckoning with yearbook photos depicting racist incidents, and as a result, students had organized for anti-racist reform at the institutional level, and so that was on our mind. And so we built this idea of not just Classics Beyond Europe, but moving classics beyond white supremacy and interrogating aspects of the discipline. And so we expanded from this basic lecture series to a broader extracurricular scope with all sorts of different kinds of programming, a film screening, an exhibit, public art commissions, talkbacks, an anti-racist pedagogy workshop, and interrogations of white fragility, these sorts of things. And we also brought in curricular components. She was slated to teach the senior seminar that spring. I was assigned to teach an additional half-term class because my department chair couldn't calculate course loads correctly, and we both decided to theme it on the issues that were at hand, and see how could we push the dialogue further. And it turned out to be a really big success. We had great engagement from not just our department, but from students and faculty across the college. Administrators paid attention. We got a large amount of funding internally and some externally to support our initiatives, and we got really high enrollments in our classes. We were it was a very rewarding experience, and a very intense intellectual exchange, and it positioned our department to be in the perfect position when the summer of racial justice advocacy in summer 2020 came about. It put us in a position to become a leader in the field. At that point during that summer, many alums of many departments at many universities wrote to their departments saying, "Here's what you need to do to become better on these issues." Our department was not alone. One of our alums led a letter that was modeled on one sent to Oxford Classics and to Bryn Mawr Classics, and the letter she put together with her colleagues, among other things, asked us to make sure that no one comes through our department without encountering critical race theory. We had a summer meeting over Zoom to decide what would we do on these demands or these requests, these pieces of advice given to us by our alums. My department chair, the same one who couldn't calculate course loads, was like, "There's no way we could possibly do this. This is unrealistic." And I said, "This request here about critical race theory is not so unrealistic because I have this course that I've taught that uses critical race theory." And we were able to get a unanimous vote in support of it, making it required for all of our majors and minors. And that's a requirement that we still have today, and we are the first and so far only, although hopefully Fairfield will be the second, classics program to require this of people majoring in, of all students majoring and minoring in our discipline. This is, I've been talking a little specific about classics, but this is something that can be expanded across disciplines. Easily you can see the transference to humanities, but you can also think, and to social sciences, but you can also think about this in any discipline, in the STEM fields, in the arts, about thinking about reckoning with past injustices and centering non-white perspectives and thinking intersectionally, thinking about the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, religion, power, citizenship, all of these things. Our Classics Beyond Whiteness series and the courses focused on three big questions: race in the ancient world, and thinking specifically about it as race, not merely as ethnicity or nationality or some other weaselly term to get around thinking about race. Two, about the engagement of our discipline with modern racial politics from the founding of the United States to the present. And third, the reception of classics, in other words, the way Greek and Roman cultures have inspired creators, artists, authors, by non-white creators, artists, and authors. Those were the big threads. It's particularly important in classics of disciplines because of the long history of using Greek and Roman culture in texts and the presumed whiteness of the ancient Greeks and Romans to justify white supremacy, even though the Greeks and Romans literally weren't white when you think about skin tone and would not have thought of themselves as white because that category did not exist for them. They constructed race in very different ways, mostly not in relation to somatic features of the body. As part of this, we want to talk specifically about extracurricular programming. You can see on the slide a list. It's very tiny, so you don't need to see every detail, but a list of the programming we did in that first year, sort of trying to hit every base, leave no stone unturned. The extracurricular question it allows you to ask anti-racist questions of your department's approach or your program's approach. Who is invited to campus? And what content do we present at events held outside of classroom hours? So you can think both about avoiding the trap of checking the box once annually by instead creating dedicated themed extracurricular programming that runs throughout the academic year. It doesn't all have to be big things like visiting lectures that involve lots of cost. It can be smaller things like reading groups. It doesn't even have to be a multi-session reading group on a book. It can be just choose one chapter from a book and have people read and come meet and spend an hour or an hour and a half talking about it. You can think about those sorts of things. Thinking about it extracurricular because that makes it accessible to all students, not just those enrolled in certain courses, although we will talk about curricular course stuff in a few moments. And I would emphasize that we had participation from students, faculty, and staff from across campus from a great variety of departments and disciplines. One of our book groups brought in people from political science, from religious studies, from math, from the divinity school, from admissions, and it was fantastic discussion, really engaged, and the better for that sort of cross-disciplinary engagement.
And I think I'll add at this point that a common piece of resistance to efforts to organize in this way is you won't have good attendance, you won't have good enrollment, it will never work. And our experience just demonstrated exactly the opposite. You're half semester credit course over enrolled, even though it didn't provide any sort of specific it didn't fulfill specific requirements for graduation. Students were just there because they were interested. We had incredible attendance and participation, as you said, across disciplines and departments. This programming was one of the richest series that the classics department had put on to date, I think because it was so expansive and because we were pressing on how we could reach beyond that perceived whiteness of the discipline. So we want to think also about course content, and of course there are the now familiar prerogatives to start including in your curriculum courses that are specifically about issues of race and gender and sexual identity in the ancient world. Beyond that, though, we want to emphasize the importance in course design when you are teaching any kind of course of thinking about the ways that you might be organizing and presenting particular facets of the world as core versus supplementary or elective. And so this is true of a lot of curricular designs that you might have a course on race and ethnicity and antiquity, but it's an elective. You might have a course on women and antiquity, but it's an elective, whereas courses like Roman history are required. So if we think of the way, let's take for an example a Roman history course. It's pretty standard for Roman history courses to run chronologically and for the main themes throughout to be things like politics and warfare and the economy. And then right at the end of the class, you get one course on women and one class meeting on systems of enslavement. And the message that distribution sends, despite the fact that throughout all of Roman history, women were in fact present, they were in fact actively participating in Roman political life, even if they weren't necessarily enfranchised in that Roman political life. The fact that the entire Roman economy was built on systems of enslavement. If you leave those topics to the end, what happens when you fall behind schedule? You have a snow day. I've seen it happen multiple times. Those courses just, they don't get made up. they get pushed to the side. And then you have students that have taken an entire Roman history course and they've never been encouraged to think about how women or enslaved people participated in that system, even though they were a huge percentage of the population. And this question of how you organize the material, I'm certainly not saying don't have a day set aside to talk specifically, to do a deep dive into these things, but also think actively about interweaving them into every single class session, no matter what it's about. Women were definitely there to some degree, right? Enslaved people were always there. Another important angle when it comes to the presentation of your course content, and this applies, I think, also broadly across disciplinary borders, is to encourage your students up front to interrogate the histories of the discipline and to confront the assumptions and the biases that they might have brought to the course. So in our coursework in classics, it's very common for us on day one to present the students with a couple terms, right? The idea of classics itself, the name of the discipline, which there are recent trends, as your program has recently done, to rename the discipline because the name classics carries serious problems with it. So we put on the board classics, we put Western civilization, we put the canon, and we put scholarly objectivity, and we invite our students from the very beginning of the course to deconstruct those terms and to think about the ways that those terms are misleading, are problematic, to think about the formation of the canon and to interrogate who decides, right? What is central, what is core versus what is supplementary. And the image we have on here, both of us assign this incredible piece that is interrogating this concept of Western civilization and problematizing that phrase as something that presents Greek and Roman antiquity as having a primacy and a centrality and often a misleading kind of whiteness that makes it the antecedent and the first originator of all that is good or sophisticated or smart or worthy of praise about the world. And it's, as this article demonstrates, it is just in every sense of the word untrue that the Greeks and Romans were predated by civilizations, Islamic civilizations, Chinese civilizations, Egyptian civilization that was extraordinarily sophisticated in so many different ways. And so whatever this means for your specific discipline, whether your discipline too is informed by this myth of Western civilization, or there are other ideas and terms that your students maybe bring previous assumptions to the class that it's worthwhile to interrogate and break down, do that up front, do it on day one so that they understand that the discipline is not this cemented set of information to absorb and then spit back out at you, but that it's an ongoing process of interpretation and knowledge formation, and everyone can still remain invested in deciding what the parameters of your discipline should be, even if that means radical change. Sorry, it's a little tiny. Another really good question to ask yourself when you're designing a syllabus, or as students when you are reading a syllabus, is who is represented on that syllabus as an expert or as a source. For classicists, when we're selecting primary sources, it is very difficult to include texts that were actually written by people from underrepresented classes. 99% of what survives was written by powerful men. However, we have lots and lots of modern scholarship that is written by people from diverse identities, and it is worthwhile to think about whether the traditional experts, particularly the ones who are foundational in the field, what does foundational in the field mean when the early days of any given field coincided with systemic injustices and histories of white supremacy and oppression. If you're just knee-jerk assigning the founding fathers of any given academic discipline, they're probably going to be white men. So can you look in more recent history, or can you look for people, for example, the Black feminist educators from that slide early on, a lot of them were from the mid-19th century. They're not necessarily included on in any given syllabus for your general classics course, but they could be. Another really important piece of curricular design to interrogate is the identity of, or rather, especially for classicists, why the canon exists in its fragmented state. So I have a little anecdote here about the way that I teach Sappho. For anyone who's not familiar with Sappho, she is the Greek poetess. She's one of the very few women whose writing survives from antiquity. And when I teach Sappho, I ask my students, why do you think she's one of the only ones? And most of them, understandably, assume that the answer is that women in antiquity were deprived of education, that they did not have the opportunity or the resources to become authors, to think in poetic terms or philosophical terms. And the really important piece of this lesson that I do every time is I hand them a handout with more than 50 names of ancient poetesses and philosophers and authors, all of whom were women. And we know that they existed because in antiquity, men praised them for their poetry. And the reason that we don't have their poetry has to do with the intervening, mediating forces of transmission. If female poetesses don't survive, it's not because they didn't exist. It's not because there were no women it's not that Sappho was special in any way. It's that the medieval monks and the Renaissance copyists who made decisions about what is worthy of preserving and circulating, they were the ones who chose not to copy over the poetry and the philosophy and the writings of these women. And this is an example of interrogating the canon not just from a modern perspective, right, but from a pre-modern perspective, and thinking about the ways that the forces, the many, many complex forces that have decided for us what survives, can in fact give us a misleading picture of what the world was like and who was allowed to participate in the construction of knowledge.
So anti-racist pedagogy or anti-racist approaches to teaching involve not just the what, but also the how. The pedagogical approaches that are brought into the course are really important for bringing anti-racism into the curriculum. And so here are we've got on the screen 4 key components. This is not all-encompassing, but these are 4 things that can be relatively straightforward. Especially the first 3 can be relatively straightforward things that you can make change to your course to bring in more anti-racist principles to your teaching if you have not already been doing these things. The first is transparency of expectations. It simply means make clear to students, make clear to people taking your courses what you expect for how they approach things, what you expect for work they do in your course, make clear expectations for what you expect them to do during class time. This is an important tool for equity because not everyone comes in with the same expectations or understanding or family traditions of going to college. And so making something transparent means that not only will the people who have had parents who were professors and their grandparents were professors and their great grandparents went to college, not only have it be clear and easy for them, but also for people who they're the first person in their family ever to go to college. And that equity, equitable approach is something that underpins a lot of anti-racist pedagogy. Is stuff that makes it equitable and accessible to all students, is something that's going to push in the direction of anti-racism. When thinking about the way you structure your assessments and the style of assessments and giving feedback, this is an area where anti-racist approaches can really help out. The standard traditional 3 tests and a final, or a couple of short papers and a long paper, those can work in an inequitable direction without a lot of support. So fewer high stakes assignments that lead to a grade that is on a scale, hopefully not with a bell curve, but 3 high stakes assignments that lead to a numerical grade that ends up in the letter grade. That traditional method hits differently for different kinds of students with different kinds of backgrounds, and ones who have had more training in how to play the game of traditional academics are going to tend to succeed better, and the ones who have not benefited from that, who don't have that kind of privilege in their background, are likely to be negatively affected by those setups. So you can think about switching from fewer higher stakes assessments to more lower stakes assessments. You can think about giving more opportunities for drafts, revision, feedback. You can think about fewer about shifting your emphasis away from summative assessments where you're assigning grades and evaluating to formative assessments where you're working on building knowledge, building skill building, and building the tools that students will need to have to succeed in more complicated tasks in your course. You can something that the two of us have experimented with in our classrooms are moving past any sort of traditional assessment structure and instead moving to, in my case, a gamified structure where students are not doing work to get grades, but instead are competing or cooperating in game environments to win against challenges. Or Professor Hines has done creative receptions where students are asked to take the subject matter from the course, connect it to their lives or their interests, and make something meaningful, create something meaningful and new that engages them with the issues of knowledge creation in the discipline and on the topics that we're choosing. Both of these are ways of giving student autonomy and agency, which is a key anti-racist principle to acknowledge that professors can't do learning for people. Only people can learn for themselves, and the best that professors can do is support students and encourage them and help them get motivated to do so. And I think that's something that a lot of traditional methods assume is already going to happen along the way, and really doesn't, and hasn't for decades, not just in the past, not just the current kids these days, but has happened since well before I was in college or Professor Hines was in college. The old methods have not been particularly effective at doing that, and they again cut across familiar lines of inequity and inequality, and so giving students ownership or control or power or agency over their learning can mean giving them autonomy over what kinds of assessments they do, or how they approach the subject matter, or what topics that they focus on, not just specifically for a paper, but you can think about for thinking about class sessions. You can have some of those class sessions be decided by students or even led by students. That's something that I've used before in the past. It's been very effective. And finally, you can think also about alternative grading schemes. One of the biggest tools of oppression in the university context, in my opinion, is grades, and I try to get away from them as much as possible. Whether you want to walk that far with me or not is another question. But what we might hopefully all agree on is that grades are a source of extrinsic motivation. In other words, something that's unrelated to the content of the course or the learning of the course, and is just something at the end that's tacked on that we use as a tool for motivation, an extrinsic motivator. Social science tells us that extrinsic motivation reduces intrinsic motivation. If you attach a reward to something that's not connected to the thing, the person doing the thing is going to be less likely to be driven to do that thing themselves. And so from that perspective alone, we should cast a big question mark over grades. And there are a lot of ways that you can seek alternatives to the traditional I, the professor, give assignments, score assignments, calculate an average, put in a number, put in a letter at the end of the semester. You can think about ones that are focused on transparency of expectations, like specifications grading, where it's a checklist of here's what you need to do to accomplish this assignment satisfactorily. If you don't, I'll send it back to you with feedback. You'll revise and resubmit. You do a certain number of those to get the grade you want in the course. Or you could think about ungrading, where students either multiple times over the course of the semester or once at midterm, once at the end, either meet with you or write a learning narrative about how their learning is going, what they've been doing in the course, their labor, their efforts, their progress, and they say, here is what I have earned for myself in the course. Here's the grade that I've earned. You can think about contract-based or labor-based grading where students and instructors at the start of the semester come to an understanding of this is the work that I will do in the course and this is the grade that work will get me. And the focus is less on performance and more on labor. Thinking in terms of labor rather than performance, outcome, or achievement is another key anti-racist tool for equity.
The next thing that we'd like to encourage you to think about is the design of educational spaces, broadly defined. And so in the first place, when we think about the architecture of the classroom, where do the students sit? Where does the instructor sit or stand? I think we were just in a lovely classroom with movable furniture. That's always a really great aspect of a classroom that can help you to be creative with the setup. But there is an implicit message when you set up your classroom with the desks in rows facing the professor and the professor stands at the front. This means that even if you try to spark a collaborative discussion, the students are individually speaking to the professor, and the professor speaks back to the students. And the hierarchy of that setup suggests that there is a single expert through which all knowledge must be funneled. You can really transform the way that a classroom discussion functions if you instead put the desks into a circle, put the seats into a circle, especially if the instructor sits in the circle with the students. The spatial messaging there that you're all coming to the conversation as people with equal ability to contribute to the construction of knowledge. It can really have an impact on the way that discussions move, on the way that information and knowledge and ideas is no longer a ping pong match between professor and student, but an actual collaborative effort where students are engaging with each other, rather than being mediated through the professor. So that's always something to keep in mind. It's also important to remember that college students don't only exist inside the classroom. They have to move through the building and they have to experience what it is to try to find spaces where they feel like they belong. I've got an image up here that this is an example from my current institution in Cincinnati, where a couple years ago, we did an undergraduate climate survey to see how they felt about the program and the department. And an overwhelming message that we got was that they had no space to gather. There were no chairs. There were no desks. The only place in the building they could go was our classics library, where they had to check their ID at the door, put their bags into a locker, no food, no drink, absolutely no talking. It's a very hostile sort of environment. And we realized that there was nowhere for them to gather. If they had time to spend outside of the classroom, they weren't even in the building. And so we found this room that was being used for storage, and we emptied it out and we furnished it and we turned it into a dedicated undergraduate lounge. And it has really changed the landscape of how the undergraduate majors even interact with each other, because a lot of them, having no space to gather, didn't interact outside of class. They just left the building. And so thinking about, do you have a designated space where your students and your majors feel welcome, that's permanent, that's for them, and that says, yes, you can gather here, you can study here, you can have a snack, you can have a conversation. Something else, and this relates directly to an initiative related to Classics Beyond Whiteness that I think we're most proud of and most excited about, is the really important question of what is hanging on the walls. When you walk through academic spaces, I think there is a pattern of framed portraits of founders. You see them everywhere at every academy that you go to, and founders, being old or having founded things a long time ago, they tend to be white men. And there are a lot of academic spaces where you just have portraits of white men everywhere, and that's all that you ever see. And we really wanted to disrupt this pattern and acknowledge that there are so many more people from so many more backgrounds that have contributed to the formation of our discipline. There are so many students, and this is specific to our experience in classics, but I think this probably can be broadened to a lot of other disciplines. There are a lot of students that feel a spark of interest in classics, but then they are discouraged from pursuing that curiosity because they never see themselves reflected in the field. They don't see professors who belong to the same identity groups as they do, and they certainly never see portraits of people who look like them hanging on the wall. And this is really an enormous loss. And so when we think actively about the way that we design our educational spaces, what are we choosing to display? What are we hanging on the walls? Who are we choosing to commemorate? That is a significant mode of communication. It communicates the priorities and the values of our field, and therefore it's an opportunity. And so at Wake Forest, we made the decision as part of the Classics Beyond Whiteness program to commission a local artist named Leo Rucker to paint portraits, 3 portraits of Black classicists from North Carolina. And here they are. So these are portraits of Helen Maria Chestnut, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and Wiley Lane. They are professors, they are teachers, they are scholars, all from the 19th century who made incredible formative contributions to the construction of the discipline, but for a lot of historical, because of systemic injustices, they were denied the sort of access to the traditional academy that you might have anticipated white people to have had at that time. And certainly no portraits of them had been hanging anywhere in classics departments around the world yet. So these portraits hang permanently now in the classics wing at Wake Forest. They're a celebration of the foundational contributions of Black scholars and teachers and leaders in the field, and they are a permanent message to anyone who walks by, whether that is a student, a current student, a potential student, merely passers-by, that the field of classics has always benefited, despite its oppressive and exclusionary practices, from a long tradition of Black excellence. So once these portraits had been commissioned, we wanted to make sure that their reach went beyond Tribble Hall, the sort of corner of the Humanities building where Classics at Wake Forest is hosted. And so we arranged for this traveling exhibition called 14 Black Classicists, which had previously been hosted at the Center for Hellenic Studies at Harvard. We arranged for it to be hosted at Wake Forest in the Central Library. And so we held an unveiling ceremony. That is the artist, Leo Rucker, in the center with one of the portraits. And they were, so this, I should say, this was in the spring of 2020, and so our plans were disrupted by the pandemic. But the plan was for the traveling exhibition to be in that library for several months. And this is a library that students from all majors, all disciplines use, and it was in a central study space. The portraits were in these sort of alcoves around the wall. And the idea was that any student using the library would see the exhibition and be surrounded by these portraits while they worked. And this is where the portraits are now. They're hung in Tribble Hall on the Classics wing, and it's quite small, but you can see we made sure that they weren't just anonymous faces. There are placards next to them with abridged biographies that emphasize who they are, why they're there, and the really essential contributions that they made to the discipline of classics.
So we've talked about course content, we've talked about extracurricular programming. Let's talk a little bit about curricular design and leading into reform at the institutional level. So this can start through coordination in your program or department about introducing new topics, new materials, new units to your courses that you already have, to centering questions that normally are marginalized or ignored when you do that, having your courses participate more fully in the social justice curriculum component of the MAGAS core. And this is again where questions about what is core and what is supplementary or elective come into the consideration. And I think that Fairfield is in a really good position with the MAGAS core having 2 social justice courses, including this SJ2R designation, having those as part of the core curriculum. I think that's really admirable and is something that calls for greater participation to make sure that that all students are able to take those courses to meet those requirements and don't need exemptions or anything like that. Realizing that that's also a challenge to necessarily get enough professors all on board with that. But that's something that we can think about as a goal in our own institutions. Is not just getting these changes on the books, but then making sure that there's the follow through so that they can be fully staffed. And part of this asking about what's core, what's supplementary, what's core, what's elective is how do the designations and the requirements impact student enrollment and learning? And then you can think, in addition to thinking core curriculum, you can think your own departmental or program requirements for majors or minors. What is something that all students in getting a major or minor in your discipline? What is something that they are going to have to take, and what are ones where they might take if it's on offer and it sounds interesting and it meets their course schedule that semester? And those kinds of decisions will also shape what your teaching schedule and your colleagues' teaching schedule looks like year to year. If you make a course like Wake Forest has with Classics Beyond Whiteness, if you make it required of majors and minors, that means you're going to be someone's going to be teaching it every semester, and that means probably more than one professor needs to be able to teach it, and hopefully that can be supported at the university level with new hires, and can be supported with professional development for current faculty to add that to their portfolio, their teaching portfolio. But those are important questions that show the way that what we choose to teach is and the resources we have for that teaching are interconnected and are both going to need to be informed by anti-racist principles. This can expand to general education requirements as it already has here at Fairfield. After Professor Hines and I put together this year of programming that then after she moved on to Cincinnati, I kept going in a sort of not somewhat reduced capacity because I didn't have her high level of energy and enthusiasm keeping me going. But as we started offering Classics Beyond Whiteness every semester and built this into our major and minor requirements, the university was also evaluating whether to revise its long sort of obsolete cultural diversity requirement that was a dead letter where there were multiple hundreds of courses that could fulfill it, and students always fulfilled it without realizing they had, and it meant nothing to them. And the dean had a hand-picked committee that had come up with something, and some of my anti-racist colleagues in other departments looked at the dean's proposal and were like, this has some uninterrogated white supremacist elements. And they went to the dean, and the dean said, it's my way or the highway. If you don't like it, write one your damn self. And so they were like, who do we know who agrees with us and is good at writing? Oh, how about that literature guy? And they came to me and they asked me to draft an alternative proposal. I did, with lots of input from everybody on the team and from reaching out to lots of other faculty. We did a grassroots campaign that ended up getting our version passed by the college faculty over the dean's version, which generated some enmity for me that had echoes down the line, which I guess we'll talk about in a second. But also meant that we had a true anti-racist curricular reform that was adopted by overwhelming majority of the faculty, and thus has a broad base of support and a broad base of actually knowing what we were asking of the faculty. The process of persuasion also was the process of informing faculty of this is what those requirements will entail. And so thinking in terms of that kind of building solidarity and building your team across divisions or disciplines and outside of just humanities or humanities and social sciences, I think can be a very powerful tool when thinking about reshaping the way college education looks for you.
Okay, so to sum up for you, or rather to give you some actual actionable advice, we've compiled a list of practicalities. We've presented you with sort of the end product of what was a fair amount of planning and labor and follow through. And so we just have a list of practical tips for you. The first one has to do with money. A lot of this was not free, nor should it have been. One of our major principles was to compensate people for their labor. It's really important to us, keeping in mind that often the labor of anti-racist reform in education falls on people of color, who are then uncompensated for those additional service loads. It was really important to us to make sure that that was the first priority in our budget. Anytime we asked anyone to do labor for us, we wanted to make sure we paid them not just fairly, but generously. So we did have to find sources of funding to make this programming happen. And in the end, I think we found the most success in applying broadly and ambitiously for mostly small funds that we knew weren't going to give us more than $500, $1,500, and combining them together in order to fund these more ambitious projects. We looked for internal funding, so various different offices and projects and funds within Wake Forest University. We also looked to discipline-specific funding. So for our discipline, there's the Society for Classical Studies Classics Everywhere grant. There's the Classical Association of the Middle, West, and South Bridge Initiative grant. I encourage you to look into your disciplinary grant funding bodies and see whether, especially after 2020, they have decided to put together some kind of grant that is specifically for this type of activity, and put together an application.
Yeah, the next practicality or practical tip is to get students involved. Students have power and agency in this too. We built partners with classics students who went to student government and found a committee chair in student government who became an ally, and the three of them went and persuaded the student government to give a substantial grant of money in support of these portraits, which we couldn't have done without them. That in turn, that was one of the things that propelled that committee chair subsequently to become student body president, evidently. Building partnerships with students and allowing students to take the initiative in coming up with ideas for programming, saying what they want to see out of this, can be a really great way to make your programming more vibrant and more inclusive.
Our next tip is to find like-minded people, like-minded collaborators. All of this labor and this work is so much easier and so much more, so much richer in the end when you are bouncing ideas off of other people, when you're sharing the labor of grant applications and programming design. And I think we agree that the whole was so much greater than the sum of its. Is that the right phrase?
Yes. Yes.
And the sum of its parts, when we realized that we both had very similar ambitions and priorities, and we decided to start working as a team. That I think was incredibly motivating and enriching.
Yeah, and along those lines, be optimistic, aspirational, and creative in your approach to, especially to thinking about what you can do with your extracurricular programming, but also when thinking about course design and curriculum design. I mentioned that the whole idea for this whole series that got us started came from a walk in the on the nature trail with Mo, and that was Professor Heinz's dog, and that where we started, where we didn't have a computer in front of, we didn't have pen and paper, we were just walking and talking, and we thought, if we didn't have constraints, what could we do? And then we just worked backwards from that, and we didn't get everything, but we got most of it, and I think we didn't expect that when we started, but we hoped for it, and that was key.
We think it's also important when you are designing programming of this sort to think actively beyond disciplinary boundaries. We've been really delighted by how interdisciplinary your university is, but I think both of us have experienced the sort of the silo of classics, which can happen, and because of that, the instinct can be to not even remember to invite people from other disciplines, but some of the best pieces of programming that we had were the best because there were participants from mathematics and religious studies and chemistry and biology, and there were librarians and there were admissions officers. Having all of them there contributing made it all so much more effective and productive. And so always keep in mind, advertise beyond the boundaries of what you might assume, rather than making assumptions about who might not be interested, just assume that everyone will be interested and make sure that everyone knows what's happening.
Yeah, and for your programming, include invitations to high-level administrators, because you never know what will happen. We organized a white fragility workshop run by Mother Uma Chandran, and we thought, who would most benefit from this other than our department chair, who we could not persuade to come? And we invited the provost, we invited the president, we invited the dean, and we actually got the provost to come, and we actually got the chief of staff for the president to come, and that was pretty big. In the provost, I was in his breakout group, and I and one of the other breakout group members, who was an undergraduate student, were able to get him to change his thinking just a little bit, and it felt like a really big win in that moment.
So once you've got your programming started, we also encourage you, to whatever extent possible, to think about aiming for permanent change. So these portraits are a really good example of the way that we leveraged the funding we were able to accrue into something material and long-lasting that will long outlive that one academic year of programming. A lot of the curricular programming that you put together in any given year is going to be ephemeral. But one thing that you can remember is that having this kind of programming regularly is going to change the landscape of who's in the room, and that can permanently change the environment and the climate, and the feeling of who is welcome, who belongs, for whom is this space designed, who can contribute, and who can and should feel invested in the future of this type of programming.
Yeah. And finally, prepare for backlash, but keep going anyhow. During the year that we did the first year that we did the programming, I did get one death threat. The campus police investigated and found that there was nothing actionable behind it. That it was just an angry person on the internet. But as word about our initiatives has spread through the discipline, it got not only some fans, including y'all who invited us here to give this talk, but also some haters. There's an article in Le Figaro, which is France's oldest weekly newspaper, one of the biggest newspapers in the country, that classifies Wake Forest among other institutions that are ces historiens de l'Antiquité qui haït l'Antiquité, which means these historians of antiquity who hate antiquity, which is very, very strong, a very strong insult coming from a French academic. You should know. But also there was retaliation, indirect retaliation from administrators. My department chair, after this year of programming, and at the department chair at the time, she became very soured on all of her junior colleagues, and bounced back and forth between neglect and backstabbing for the rest of her time there. The dean at the time, who's now the provost, who did not come to the White Fragility workshop, she really didn't like it, possibly because her husband was one of the people in the racist photos in the yearbook at Wake Forest in the 80s. She really didn't like the programming, and so she has used her power at different times to try to retaliate against in petty ways against individual members of my department. But I wouldn't have done things differently. Like the part of anti-racist principles are people who have benefited from privilege need to pay as part of doing the work. That there might be a price to pay, and this is a price that I've been willing to pay as part of it. That this kind of backlash has been worth it for the good that I feel that we've been able to do. And at the same time, it can be useful to be a little to gild your optimism and aspirations and creativity that we were encouraging with some caution and some protection, and thinking about ways that you can think ahead of time of building relationships and building bases of support that might give you some cover, or might come to your aid if you face a particularly embittered response to your work.
Thank you so much for your time, for the invitation. We're so excited to have had the opportunity to share with you some of our experiences. We hope that you found it inspirational and aspirational, and maybe you found some ideas that you could model your own planning and programming after across disciplinary boundaries. And we are very happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our presenters. We have a microphone here that I'm happy to take off the stand to bring to you if you have any questions, things that you'd like them to expand upon, or anything along those lines. So I will take this off the stand and bring it to anybody that has any questions or thoughts that they would like to share.
So I can get things started. First and foremost, thank you for a fabulous presentation. You talked a little bit about this already, but since we have a number of students in the audience today, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about how students can sort of initiate these conversations with their instructors. I'd love to hear more.
Well, I'd say that one of the first steps is to come at it, say to yourself before you start the conversation, I'm going to be constructive, and sort of come in with a Pollyanna-ish view of your professor, that you're not calling them out, you're not even calling them in, which is sort of the social justice movement approach to dealing with troubling things, but instead you're like, here's something I'm excited about that I'm sure my enthusiasm will make them excited about too. So I guess another way of saying this is in addition to white fragility, just we're all fragile, and professors that developing a course and teaching a course is a highly emotional act, and is a highly psychologically taxing event, and also something that is connected with all sorts of aspects of the last 10 or 30 or 50 years of our life that we've poured into this thing. And so approaching with that kind of empathetic connection, I think, would be an important first step. But also, that shouldn't steer you away. You should think, because they are so invested in this topic that they got a degree in it and are doing a career in it or teaching a class in it, because that's all the more reason that you should start this conversation with them in this very optimistic, aspirational sense.
And I think you can also lean into the extracurricular potential of it all. It might be that something you're very interested in, your professors maybe can't at this stage find room in their syllabus. However, you have an annual endowed lecture that they organize. You can go to them and suggest, I'd really love to see a professor present about a certain topic, or a presenter who's from a background like me. Those are definitely the kinds of requests that you can communicate to whoever's in charge of selecting the speaker.
Yeah.
Your dean and your department chair sound like lovely people. As the person guilty of teaching Roman history here for the last 15 years, I just wanted to say how much fun I had listening to you describe my class while one of my students sat behind me laughing. You are absolutely right, and it's an eye-opening thing to hear it said, and so I'd like to invite further comment, either at the level of specific examples that you would recommend for integration into a curriculum, or more general thoughts about how, this is what I've struggled with, you balance the absence of good evidence covering the general lives of women with the strength of evidence about specific women who are very likely exceptional. And I've never known how to do that. I'd like to hear more on either of those two things.
So something that I do in particular, I'll take, for example, a unit, a sort of perhaps early unit about foundational histories and the stories that the Romans themselves tell about their foundation, right? Which includes, if we lean into the Augustan legendary Aeneid of it all, right? Tracing their origins back to Troy. It includes Romulus and Remus. It includes the story of Lucretia's assault and the overthrow of the Etruscan kings. It also includes the rape of the Sabine women, leaning into, although we don't have necessarily these stories told from in the voices of women, leaning into the fact that the Romans conceptualized their body politic as something that was so contingent upon ownership over women's bodies, marrying them against their will, assaulting them. And that was something that they weren't necessarily ashamed of, right? This is central to their conceptualization of what made the Roman Republic great, was that the rape of Lucretia inspired them to overthrow the kings and to establish a republic. And earlier in their history, when Romulus found that they didn't have enough women to marry and they couldn't persuade surrounding communities to marry, they just decided to trick them and to steal away all of their wives. So leaning into the power of myth and storytelling as something that for the Romans must have been formative for their broader perspectives on their foundational histories and what it meant for politics to be political structures to have been caused by and founded by violence against women's bodies. That's one of the first lessons that I teach in not just history classes, but myth classes and literature classes, as a foundational way of thinking about the stories that they told themselves about where they came from.
Thank you again. So regarding like the practical aspect, how do you think you transition from teaching from the academic to common viewership? Say, go to the Met. There's not much context beyond statues and the insignias, but people aren't reading that, right? People's common conception of like Julius Caesar is people often use that as like a basis for white supremacy, right? So how do you take this from a very a small group of students in a lot of universities and transition it to becoming the common narrative that people understand and that people in the common audience will receive?
I think that's an enormous challenge, and one of sort of that is a microcosm of the larger challenge of how do academics make their work relevant. But I think part of it is that the more that we do the work within the discipline, the more chance it has of making the jump. Especially, I think of like the documentary connection that documentarians are going to professors, and so if they're going to professors who are thinking on this, who are working on this, who are teaching on this, then that's going to filter its way into the mainstream a little more, and then from there we'll get into court sort of questions of what stories get told, who gets cast, that sort of thing. I think the Met is an interesting question. My understanding is that they recently had an exhibition where they focused on polychromy, on the fact that statues, ancient Greek and Roman statues, weren't faded white marble but were brightly painted, and that they had an exhibition that focused on that. And so things like that I think are great things that that museum curators and art historians can get involved in. I think that having a scholarly apparatus to back up what happens when, like, the kind of response you see like years ago when the BBC and Netflix did this Trojan War TV show. They cast a black actor for Achilles, and there was like a huge backlash from a lot of white British people who were really upset about it in particular. But there were scholars at the ready to say, it's not just that this is a reasonable casting choice, but it's also that your very idea of Roman Britain is totally wrong and not nearly so white. And here's the receipts. Here's the historical evidence to demonstrate that there were people who were born and raised in Africa who were serving in Roman Britain, serving in the army in Roman Britain, that sort of thing. So I think it's a combination of waiting for getting the ground fertile for the circumstances to be right, for when someone comes in and says, hey, I'm looking for an expert on Cleopatra, and we have someone who's got a critical race theoretical understanding of Cleopatra instead of a Liz Taylor understanding of Cleopatra.
I think there's also something to be said more broadly for the importance of cultivating the instinct in students in any discipline to interrogate the dominant narratives, right? Including the narratives that seem to have, especially the ones that have this sort of academic power behind them. So for example, if you walk into the British Museum and you go into the wing where the Parthenon marbles are, the message that the museum will give you is, we so generously rescued these marbles during an invasion of Greece, and we are protecting them, and only we have the resources and the power to keep them safe. However, if you were to ask anyone from Greece, anyone from a lot of different countries, those marbles were looted, and they have been working tirelessly, trying to work within frameworks of the very complicated legal system to do with antiquities theft and looting to get those marbles back. And so just the instinct when you're in a museum, even though everything seems so authoritative, to know that you should be feeling suspicious, right? It doesn't mean that everything is wrong, but it means that even information that is presented in a format that you have been taught to feel is authoritative, it could be misleading, it could be manipulative.
Actually, you don't need the microphone, but I'll take it.
For recording purposes.
Sure, of course. So when you were pitching this, how did you problematize the concepts of race and whiteness? Because I can recall when we were working our way through the S.J. Magis core curriculum that the response on the part of some folks was, well, race doesn't exist in X version of the world.
Yeah, and that I think that traditionally classicists have been on the vanguard of saying race doesn't exist in this version of the world. So part of it, this was something where we were able to stand on the shoulders of giants. Shelley Haley has been working on this since the 90s, and then has been joined since the early 2010s by a lot of other scholars doing excellent work on this. And I think that the being able to articulate, no, it's not that race didn't exist, it's that their concept and construct of race was different from ours. I find it easiest when I'm trying to persuade a classicist who doesn't agree with me on this, which has happened many times, and usually in cordial situations where they just don't buy it. I find it easiest to start with sexuality and then get to gender, because no serious classicist thinks that our construct of sexuality and ancient Athenian constructs of sexuality is the same, because no serious classicist thinks that thinks it was non-normative for elite Athenian men to be attracted to both men and women, and to have sexual encounters with men at some points in their life and women at other points in their life. And I'm able to say, that's different from how we construct our sexuality now, right? Like, you wouldn't say that Socrates was straight, bi, or gay. You wouldn't use that terminology, seriously, would you? And then from there we can get to, okay, so maybe constructs of race are similar in that we don't have to think in terms of white or black in ancient context, but we also don't have to think that because they weren't thinking in terms of white and black, there's no race at all. And then I make appeals to things like, and this is again building on scholars like Denise McCoskey, on what are effectively racial policies in Greek-occupied Egypt, Roman-occupied Egypt, and in Athens, where it's the clearest. But also thinking about like the ways that the Hippocratic corpus talks about different peoples and essentializes them, and I'm like, okay, this is clearly racecraft. So that's sort of the way that we came at it. When it came to whiteness in particular, that was sort of, I think, the phrase "classics beyond whiteness" was intended to be aspirational and a provocation, because certainly classics has not been de-whited or has not moved past whiteness, and we as white people have not somehow changed the paradigm entirely. But it was rather meant to push people to think about how often those two words go together unthinkingly, and when people say classics, they're thinking whiteness, and that was the goal there, and also as part of it to bring the focus onto non-white creators, artists, and authors, and to Greeks and Romans not thinking of themselves as white.
And I think another important aspect of this conversation, which even someone who's skeptical of accepting the incredible argument that you just made, is the question of translation, especially those of us who are teaching texts to students who don't have access to the original language in which they were written. So we are relying on translators' renditions of those texts. And you can trace historically very clear examples of translators who are introducing racial bias into their translation that is not there in the original text. So regardless of what was going on in antiquity, we still have to contend with the effects of racial prejudice and bias within the texts that give us the opportunity to teach to students who don't speak those languages. So it remains relevant regardless.
I have a question. Thank you so much for this presentation. I might be biased, but I thought it was fabulous. I particularly appreciated the point about pedagogy in the classroom and thinking about giving students autonomy and agency over the way that they engage with the material. I particularly love assigning creative assignments and things like that too. And I also appreciate what Dr. Geller-Goad said about, sort of the emotional aspect of creating a syllabus and sort of pouring yourself into that, because we think we know our material, we've been trained in it. My question is, in creating those opportunities for students to have autonomy in terms of their learning, in terms of creative projects, in terms of things that are not traditional essays or things like that, has there ever been a moment when a student approaches the material in a way that makes you go, huh, I never thought about it that way before? Like something new that comes out of their engagement with the material that either you hadn't thought about before because of your own positionality, or things that made it clear to you, right, this is the right way to go about it, by giving students the ability to engage with the material on their own terms. Has there been a moment like that for either of you?
You want to go first?
Many, so many. So I really am enthusiastic about assigning creative receptions in my in almost all of my courses, which I teach mostly literature courses. And I have found that giving students choice in the particular approach that they take, the angle that they take on any given text or image or idea from antiquity, produces these incredible results that I never would have come up with on my own. They have perspectives on the texts, especially students who aren't majors, who haven't had previous training in the discipline, because that training, however hard we try to resist it, it restricts your point of view, right? Because you're sort of taught, here's the right way to look at the text. I think I can give a few examples of some of the final projects in a course that I taught where the mission of the final project was, if you had all of the money in the world, what initiative would you design and implement to bring an idea or a text or an image from antiquity to the modern world in a humane and empathetic way? So I had a student who was in the ROTC. She was a senior, and after she graduated, she would enlist in the Army. And she designed a traveling lecture series and reading group of Homer's Iliad to be read with currently enlisted soldiers so that they could process questions about war trauma and moral injury and grief and loss and love on the battlefield. I had another student who, in the course of the semester, realized that they were trans non-binary, and their final project was a recasting of Aristophanes' Lysistrata, which is a Greek comedy about women going on sex strike in order to stop a war. This student recast the entire play in a sort of creative, non-fiction way, an analytical way in which all of the characters were queer in some way, whether they were gender queer or they identified with queer sexual identities. And this was a way for the student to see themselves reflected in the text in a way that I had never envisioned before, and the results were incredible.
An early experience for me when I was still in graduate school and I was teaching in a third semester Latin course. I assigned a translation assignment where each student had to take one of the poems of Catullus that we'd read and translate it into poetic English, whatever that meant for them. And I think this is something that other people come to more quickly than I do. But this realization for me took until graduate school that even a genre that is like Catullus erotic poetry, which is so highly artificial and constructed, that it can have really deep personal meanings and connect to people. One of my students took one of the poems of Catullus, the Catullus speaker writing to Lesbia and complaining about her infidelity, and he did a faithful translation, but changed the name from Lesbia to his recently broken up ex-boyfriend, and like he used the translation assignment to work through some of the emotions around the breakup, and I was like, wow. And like around the same time, I learned from one of my colleagues in grad school that when he was coming out, he was reading some of Catullus's poems over and over to help him get through the days or something like that, and I was like, okay, these kind of connections. So that's one thing. Much more recently, my most recent book is a commentary on a play by Plautus, a Roman comedy, and one of the I test drove the commentary with my students as I was writing it, and one of my students really intensely changed my thinking about the young woman in danger in this play, when she's talking about this backstory in her childhood when she was kidnapped, uses this one phrase that says like I was nearly dead. And I'd been interpreting this as just like sort of, this is a metaphor or a hyperbole, and this student was suggested that it was instead like lined up with symptoms of a panic attack, and that maybe this person was undergoing a panic attack, or this young girl was undergoing a panic attack, and I thought that was really interesting, and it reshaped my thinking, and I credited her with that point in the commentary.
Do you have any other questions, comments, thoughts for our presenters? All right, with that, I think we can thank them for a wonderful presentation.